We are, living in very interesting and dangerous times, it seems. That is, the US global hegemony, which defined the world order, is already gone. The US is acting in increasingly unpredictable ways. It can't rely on free trade anymore, as it can't compete with China. We see instead militarism being used to enhance its position. Former alliances no longer serves its purpose and are falling apart quickly. We see more extractive economic relationships being set up, a war on Russia, possible war on China, likely soon a war with Iran, snatching Greenland. Of course, we had the attack on Venezuela, and Trump already listed a few more Latin American countries he would like to go after. International law doesn't seem to be doing very well, as the US and the Europeans are not just seizing ships, but attacking ships, with a retaliation coming at least from Russia, I think, in not too long time. And of course, the US appears to be heading towards bankruptcy, or at least a major economic crisis, also of the dollar. But instead of restoring fiscal discipline, the US is acting like a drunk sailor. So why not just increase the military budget to $1.5 trillion? I mean, we seem to be heading towards a major showdown. So how are you assessing this, the wider situation here? Because is this economics that's driving this meltdown, or it seems to be a bit too many dangerous things all being done at the same time?
Yeah, sure. It's as you said, these are very dangerous times, unprecedented and extremely difficult to interpret. And obviously, economics is ultimately at the foundation of everything, but I think that the issues that we're dealing with are complex because they strike at the whole order of alliances that we got used to from World War II. And some of these alliances serve interests and investments that are not, that they have much longer time scale than what we're looking at. A cargo ship, a shipload of oil here and a shipload of oil there, a few tens or a few $100 million in stolen oil, taking control of Venezuela's oil. I think all of that is happening in the immediate cycle, whereas we seem to be shifting millennia, we seem to be shifting eras. We might even be going into a direction that is completely different from what we got used to over the past 500 years. So things are extremely confusing and difficult to read. And I think that nothing is quite what it seems. Starting with Venezuela, I'm still dumbfounded that Trump went to Venezuela with his military and kidnapped Nicolas Maduro and brought him to New York to stand trial. That action had such poor risk to reward ratio that I can't help believing that it's the result of some kind of a deal. Between who and who is difficult to say, but the more I learn about the situation, the more I'm inclined to believe that the deal was actually between Trump and Maduro themselves. That Nicolas Maduro was extricated there. And this is, beware, you're getting a world exclusive, because I just reached this conclusion tomorrow. And I don't know that I'm right. It's just one of the plausible explanations of what happened. The Trump was actually preempting a regime change in Venezuela, because what did he do? He brought Maduro out. Some former special operations and intelligence professionals that I spoke with share my belief that that Maduro was taken simply in protective custody. And why would that be the case? Well, we've all noticed that regime never changed. Nothing at all about the regime in Venezuela changed other than Nicolas Maduro being taken out. Now, we have to shift attention a little bit to the national security strategy of the United States. And it underscores the Monroe Doctrine, and it talks about dismantling the infrastructure of adversarial powers in the Western Hemisphere. And so at the first blush, you would think they're talking about China and Russia. And, China and Russia made important investments in Venezuela. They didn't amount to much, but, they're still there present. And so it seems that Trump has a problem with China and Russia. But then, taking that much of a risk over something that could have been done in a completely different manner, meaning Trump could have made a deal with Nicolas Maduro, and he will, in the end, do deals with the Venezuelan government as is. Trump could have spoken about the situation with the Chinese, with the Russians, and come to an understanding, which they probably did anyway. So why all the fireworks? What is the point? And I find two data points here very interesting. Well, three actually. One is that I think in 2024, the G7 issued a statement disputing the legitimacy of Maduro government. So that was after elections, or was it 22? I'm confused now. Well, the last elections. They issued a statement. And so let's remember, G7 is the European colonial powers. Britain, France, Germany, the United States was still, how do you call it, Biden administration or whatever, Blinken and Sullivan administration. So completely in the grip of the neocons. And they dispute Nicolas Maduro's government's legitimacy and reject the results of the elections. So they issued a formal statement about this, which I thought was very interesting. It doesn't say much. It just says about that much. And then, the Nobel Committee gives a Nobel Peace Prize to Maria Corina Machado, which is a strange thing in itself. And that one, I was certain from the start that it didn't come from Trump, meaning it wasn't Trump administration that leaned on the Nobel Committee to say give the award to Maria Corina Machado. So it came from elsewhere. And to my mind, it could have come only from one other side, and that is the globalist rules-based order. However we want to label it, is it the Davos set? Is it the City of London? Is it Great Britain and European powers? But it's there, and it's probably very closely linked to the European banking oligarchies. And so I think that there was a chance that they were going to stage a similar kind of regime change process as they have just done in Iran. A color revolution, because Venezuela was, probably still is, full of CIA, MI6 assets and so forth. And then the third data point about this is the thing called Organization of American States that nobody really pays much attention to. They try to remain under the radar, but it's actually a massive behemoth which has been extremely active and increasingly active in the South America and the Caribbean, pretty much implementing what you would call the global goals, the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030 of the United Nations, the Great Reset, with great involvement of the big tech from the United States, Microsoft, Facebook, Jeff Bezos, Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. The ideas were to implement things like internet connectivity, digitization of government, implementation of central bank digital currencies. They had a massive initiative there called Better Than Cash, which was trying to promote adoption of digital currencies for everyone. Electoral reforms, gender issues, so climate change issues, energy transitions. So basically, all of these initiatives that we kind of got inured to in the West that had to do with this globalist agenda, climate change, LGBT ideology, digital IDs, central bank digital currencies, surveillance, smart cities, all of that was being increasingly pushed into South America and the Caribbean with billions of dollars. And this Organization of American States is a special kind of thing because it works in conjunction with the United Nations, but it's not part of the United Nations. So they work together, but OAS is autonomous. And then Organization of American States enjoy immunity, complete legal immunity. So they're not at all liable to U.S. laws or laws of any of the nations involved. And that their headquarters are in Washington, D.C., but they enjoy a special status, meaning the United States law enforcement cannot go to their premises. They cannot take their documents, their computers. They cannot. Basically, there's nothing they can do. They're completely outside of the law. And so, having said all that, and there's a lot to it, we go back to the U.S. National Security Strategy, and when they say dismantling the infrastructure of the adversarial powers, this to me seems like a far, far greater threat to the security of the United States, and particularly to the Trump administration and any administration that would like to extricate the United States from the global empire, than anything that Russia and China are doing there. Because the Russians and the Chinese are doing straight up business and security type of cooperation with, Venezuela and other Latin American nations. Here we have basically an incubator of all these dystopian globalist ideas that the Trump administration has rejected for the United States. And then part of that whole equation is flooding the United States with uncontrolled immigration. And part of it is flooding the United States with drugs, which are not coming from Venezuela in large amounts, if any. They're largely coming from Mexico, Ecuador, and Canada. And then a much bigger problem, is the money laundering, because without the services of money laundering banks, the drug, weapons, and human smuggling cartels would splinter and become easy to deal with. But because they have money laundering banks services, they are robust hierarchical organizations that have massive amounts of money at their disposals, with which they buy things like heavy weaponry. They have troops of commandos. They have whole brigades. They have armored personnel carriers, helicopters, submarines, heavy weaponry. All of this is a threat. And then, with all of this in sight, we go back to statements by Donald Trump, by Marco Rubio, and others, and you see that they're talking about tackling the drug smuggling networks, which Maduro isn't really anywhere near the top of the list of suspects. So the whole thing seems extremely strange. And I don't think that we have a clear explanation, but the range of plausible explanation is so broad that I think we'll just have to wait to see what happens. But I think that one of the plausible explanations is that the whole intervention in Venezuela was actually Trump preempting a regime change operation, because, you know, if these globalist forces, this let's call it UN Agenda 2030, Great Reset, if these forces took over Venezuela, then Venezuela becomes possibly a really dangerous beachhead in the region that could threaten to destabilize the United States. So the idea was maybe preserve the regime, but do a token action by removing Maduro. And I also have to say, I then went, when I did a bit of research about the Organization of American States and what they do and who because they're working with literally hundreds of non-government organizations and, let's say, civil society, things like George Soros' Open Society and so on. And they have this deal where their legal immunities are automatically transferred to their agents and representatives. So let's say if Alex Krainer becomes a contractor with Organization for American States, I get their immunity. So now if I go across the border, you cannot search my luggage, you cannot search my documents, you cannot take my phone, my computer, and you cannot sue me, you cannot take any legal action against me. And so, Microsoft, Facebook, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Open Society, George Soros' Open Society Institute, all of these NGOs and civil society organizations enjoy that immunity as they're pushing the Great Reset, Agenda 2030, practically through the whole region, through the whole Western Hemisphere, south of the United States borders. Venezuela is the only country in that region who is no longer a member of OAS, which is why I thought, okay, in that case, at least from the ideological point of view, they shouldn't be in an adversarial relationship with the Trump administration, because since Chavez came to power, the relationship between Venezuela and the Organization of American States has started to deteriorate to a point where the OAS became kind of the same as IAEA, where it was set up with one set of ideas, but then it got completely co-opted into these globalist agendas, and they became one of the champions of disputing the legitimacy of the Maduro regime. But at the same time, ideologically, they are the greatest and most dangerous enemy to the United States, plus legal immunity, plus tax exemptions, and all kinds of other privilege that the Chinese and the Russians don't have themselves. So I think it's very, very hard to to know what the Trump administration knows about all this, and I think that they know a lot, because very soon after they abducted Maduro, Trump announced that they were withdrawing from 66 of these international organizations. The OAS wasn't one of them, but they did put OAS under review, and they did apparently suspend some of OSA programs in the United States and U.S. funding for some of the programs. And, these are all these 60, there were a total of about 76. There is a total of about 76 of these international organizations that enjoy legal immunities and tax exemptions and so forth. and Trump withdrew the United States from 66 of them. So that tells me that this is the infrastructure that they are really targeting. It's not necessarily China. It's not necessarily Russia. It's not necessarily about the oil in Venezuela. I think it's really what George Soros said, clash between two systems of governance. And this globalist system of governance is using all these international organizations that have immunities, that they get to do whatever they like, which is why, like we wonder, why is Bill Gates a free man? Why is Anthony Fauci a free man? Why are they spraying our skies and nobody is held accountable? It doesn't seem that anybody is ever held accountable, and it's because they all enjoy legal immunities. And the United States law enforcement cannot go after them. Anyway, it's long, it's very convoluted, it's very complicated, but if you focus on some case studies, let's say trafficking of fentanyl, methamphetamines, and marijuana, well, and other drugs from Canada to the United States, you realize a great source of danger to the United States. And then you realize that a lot of these organizations are immune. They are simply out of reach of the United States law enforcement. And it's a source of great frustration to the United States. For your viewers, I would there's an online publication called The Bureau, which in March of this year published an extensive interview with a man named David Asher. David Asher was a high-level official of the U.S. State Administration and is an important part of the Trump administration's drug enforcement and financial crimes task force. And he gave an interview in which he explains a lot of these things that neither Marco Rubio mentions nor Trump mentioned. Well, Trump did mention after the kidnapping of Maduro that a lot of the drugs are coming from Canada. But then the media is not interested. They don't say like, oh, wait, did you say Canada? What do you mean exactly? Could you elaborate? Nobody asks. It's like nobody wants to know. And he didn't elaborate. But if you go back to that interview with David Asher, he explains a lot. And he makes it very clear that the United States has a massive frustration with the Canadian government, which is completely uncooperative. Even when they bust these massive fentanyl labs in Canada, and they get proof about colossal scale money laundering by Canadian banks, there's no arrests, there's no charges, there's no investigations. Nothing happens. These people just simply continue. They change their telephone numbers, they change their addresses, they change their operations around a little bit, and they continue to smuggle drugs into the United States. So I suspect that the action in Venezuela had to do with all this. How exactly? I'm not sure, because Venezuela doesn't seem to fit the list of suspects very well. And then again, the risk to reward from that action just doesn't seem to make any sense at all. So it's a different kind of warfare, and it's obviously being waged covertly and by deception. And so even what we know, through public statements and press releases, doesn't tell us the truth. It doesn't give us the full picture.